Well, good afternoon, everybody. Okay. Well, we just had a long and engaged and impassioned discussion about how we rein in this seemingly out of control spending, this unending gap in our spending and revenue or deficits, and the national debt, which is now the highest as a percentage of GDP in the history of our country. And I don't think anybody, whether you're Republican or Democrat or somewhere in between, I don't think anybody can look at our balance sheet as a nation or the CBO's projections over 10 years, where we triple interest payments, we double our annual deficits. I don't think anybody can look at that and not be terribly concerned about the future of our country and our children's future in this country. And so I know the speaker, and I take great solace and confidence that before he was even elected speaker, he said, I think multiple times and very emphatically, that the two greatest threats he believed facing our country was China and the national debt. So as the new budget chairman, it's great to have that support from the top. And now we got to work through all the details, but there are tremendous opportunities on the debt ceiling side, on the discretionary 24 budget, and on the long-term budget framework. But the goals are the same: rein in the spending, reduce the debt to GDP, restore fiscal responsibility in our nation's capital, and give our kids. I've got 3 children, 12, 10, and 8, and I tell you, I think that the jury is still out about whether they will inherit the blessings of liberty and the opportunities we've had on account of a debt-related crisis if we don't change course. Last thing I'd say is, and I'm happy to take questions, but I got the president's budget. It came in about 30 days late, but he got it to us. He says, and I agree, budgets are more than just numbers on a balance sheet. They are values, and they are a vision for the future. And I'm very concerned about his vision for my country's future and your country's future. To me, when I go through this budget that really doubles down on this out of control spending and failed economic policies and some of the big government programs that are driving this spending, I worry, because the people in my district, and I'm sure in Jason's district in Missouri and all around the country, they are suffering tremendously with inflation. 15 months of record inflation, and now soaring interest rates, and as a result, an economy that's receding and the prospect of a sustained stagnant economy. So the outlook is bleak, but it's not hopeless. We just have to intervene in a responsible way, and we have to turn what is the Titanic, really, because we didn't get here overnight. We won't get out of it overnight. But to do nothing, or to just repeat the same policies, which is what I see in the president's budget: highest sustained taxes, spending, and deficits in the history of the country. He's either disconnected from what's going on in this country, or he doesn't care. I don't know which one, but the result is, with all the spending and the taxing, you're going to get a deeper dive or spiral into recession. You're going to have, with more welfare without work requirement expansion, you're going to get more people on the sideline and lower participation in the workforce, and you're going to get more inflation. Taxes are passed on mostly to consumers and higher cost. Taxes are also passed to employees and lower wages. We've been through this before. We need to get back to growth, and we talked a lot about that in our discussion. 1% of GDP over 10 years is $3 trillion in deficit reduction. CBO's projection is 2%. golly, are we going to accept 2% annual growth? We were at 3% in 18. The last 75 years, 75-year average is over 3%. For decades, we've been upward of 4%. With pro-growth, pro-work, pro-American energy production policies, I think we can get this, we can right the ship and get on good financial footing and do what the folks in World War II. After World War II, that was the next highest level of indebtedness. It's comparable to where we are today. They reduced the spending, they grew the economy, and you know what? America emerged as the only global superpower. But that's all at risk if we don't change course. But we've got a plan to do it, and I'm proud to work alongside my friend and colleague from the Boot Heel of Missouri, Jason Smith.
Thank you, Chairman Arrington.
It was supposed to be.
Oh, really? Not necessary. We had Jody summed up a lot of the discussion, but our panel was supposed to just be an hour and 30 minutes. It lasted for 30 minutes longer than that because of the family discussion. We've made it a point that how we legislate in this conference, it's 222, and that's how we'll move, whether it's the budget or whether it's the debt limit. And we had several members in the discussion when they would make statements or present questions, they would say this was the best panel that they've been a part of. And it's something that's extremely important because the folks who we represent are struggling every day to put food on their table, clothes on their backs, and gasoline in their cars because the highest cost of goods in 41 years because of reckless government spending. We want to make the economy strong. The best way to look at how to make an economy strong is what made the economy not as strong. And those are the policies of the one-party Democrat rule under Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi, and Chuck Schumer. $10 trillion in new spending over the last 2 years. A war on U.S. energy, whether through taxes or regulation, whether it was incentivizing people to stay at home and not work, whether it was allowing policies to move forward where China is strengthened, whether it was increasing taxes and regulations on small businesses, or whether it's just not simply negotiating any trade agreements for U.S. farmers and American-made products. That is what has led to a bad economy. We saw a great economy. The last time Republicans controlled the House, the Senate, and the White House, we had the best economy in a generation, the lowest unemployment rate in 50 years, the lowest number of folks in poverty. Median middle-class household income rose nearly $6,000, which was 5 times as much as the prior Obama administration. And how did we do that? Reduce regulations. One out of for every one new regulation, we cut 8 when we were last in power. We addressed trade agreements, USMCA. That was a very, very big trade agreement with our largest trading partners, Canada and Mexico. And then we looked at unleashing our energy. And then we did the Tax Cut and Jobs Act in 2017. And when we did the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, GDP raised over a 1% from where it had been the prior 10 years. The prior 10 years, GDP was an average of 1.5%. The 2 years following the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, it was 2.6%. Every 1%, as Jody said, of GDP growth over 10 years will cut the deficit by $3 to $3.5 trillion. Growing the economy will be a big aspect in helping people's lives better, making it easier for them to put food on their table, clothes on their backs, and gasoline in their cars. I'm happy to take all the easy questions. Jody will take the difficult questions.
I'm done.
So, who's got the easy one? Get up here, Jody.
Yeah, go ahead. Start here and work our way around.
This one is for Chairman Smith. You've said earlier this year that you thought one area that Democrats and Republicans could work on would be the child tax credit. Is that still the case? Have you had any discussions that you can talk about with your Senate counterparts any details on progress?
I've definitely had a lot of negotiations with my Senate counterparts and also Democrats and House members, Democrats and Republicans in the House as well. I know that the Republican Party is the party of the working class, and we need to make sure that our priorities that we push are that of the working class. That's who we represent. That's who elects us. And that's why I've put front and center small businesses, farmers, and working class Americans as top of the priority. The child tax credit is something that I have been a sponsor of. I was one of the leading advocates when we did the 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act, doubling the child tax credit from $1,000 to $2,000. I'm a huge believer in work requirements. I've made it crystal clear. We saw the disaster of eliminating work requirements of what had happened back in 2021. I mean, when they eliminated the work requirement suspended in the American Rescue Plan back in 21, only 1.6 million people returned to the workforce. That expired December 31st of 21. Just in the months of January and February alone, 1.7 million people returned to work when they had to work in order to get the child tax credit. So I feel very confident that we can find common ground with the child tax credit, getting some very good feedback from folks on the other side of the building, but also on our side of the building. What that final product looks like, I think that's pretty tough to predict, but at least there's open grounds of communication right now.
Let's kind of work our way around.
So again, on the child tax credit, last week Senator Daines suggested that lawmakers would eliminate the state and local tax deduction to make that permanent, like the Biden administration was. Is that something you would be supportive of?
Okay, you're not talking about the child tax credit, you're talking about the SALT deduction.
So Senator Daines was saying to make that child tax credit permanent, to eliminate the state and local tax deduction completely.
Well, I mean, Senator Daines, a lot of senators come up with different ideas. I didn't see that, but the state and local tax deduction expires in 2025 with several provisions of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. With its expiration, it's going to be roughly $800 billion to the budget that it's going to cost to subsidize those higher taxing states as California, New York, New Jersey. Those are the three largest. And to expand the child tax credit, it's roughly $130 billion. So that's probably why he's throwing those numbers out there. But I think there's going to be a lot of other aspects that people's going to be looking at for some savings. But to know the absolute approach, who knows? State and local tax deduction came up today in our discussion. It was a very good discussion. As you know, even in our majority, we have some folks that's very concerned about the marriage penalty that's within the state and local tax. I believe Representative Garcia and Representative Lawler both have legislation that affects that. We're a majority of 222, and we're going to work together to get things done.
Last question.
Sir?
Oh, man, this is so tough. Let's go here, and then Rachel, because she called me and I didn't return her call. And I'm going to confess that right here on the, right here
Then it should be
live.
a tough
It's
question.
because I used to see you around, and then I don't know where you went.
I had a baby and wrote a book. It's
What-
fun.
My goodness.
No problem.
You've been productive.
It sounded like the presentation was productive today.
Yeah.
Can you give us an update of where you think Republicans made progress today, and if there are any even broad contours of an agreement when it comes to debt ceiling open talks?
Yeah, I think the consensus is we have to right-size the bureaucracy. Coming out of COVID, go back to CBO's projections in 19 pre-COVID. They predicted we'd be spending about $330 billion less discretionary spending than we are today. Look, there were some monies that needed to be spent, and there was a whole lot of money that was unnecessarily spent. But now, coming out of COVID, we've got to reset. And I think everybody's in agreement. So you've heard the commitment of FY24 budget discretionary at 22 levels. That's 130 billion in savings. So just to compare and contrast President Biden's budget. So one thing you have to do if you're going to stop the inflationary firestorm wreaking havoc across the country, mainly on working Americans, is you got to stop the spending that is driving it. President Biden requests a 6% increase, about $93 billion in discretionary, 2 non-defense dollars for every 1 defense dollar. We're taking back 9% reduction and saying, let's get to 22, let's reset, right size, and move from there. If you do that, it's about 1.7 trillion in savings over 10 years. And if you control spending by an average of 1% every year through the 10 years, you're almost up to 3 trillion. So you add a percentage to the growth in GDP with pro-growth tax policies, deregulation, unleash American energy, and these other pro-growth, pro-work policies. And all of a sudden, you're now close to $6 trillion. That's a good start. So I think that that's one aspect of the conference coalescing around as a priority. Look, we know we have to get beyond just the discretionary expansion of the wasteful, unnecessary bureaucracy, and we have to get beyond even growth. We have to grow if we're going to get out of this debt hole. We have to, just like we did in post-World War II. But at the same time, we can't just grow out of it. And we know long-term mandatory spending is driving the debt. I said it before I got this job. I'm going to keep saying it because it's true. And those are tougher decisions to make. And I'm not going to presume on my colleagues on my committee or the conference, but we're having those conversations. And I think they're pretty straightforward. And most people, I think, believe that they're not just common sense, they're better for making programs more effective and more accountable and more cost effective to meeting the needs that were probably articulated 50 years ago but haven't changed. And so those are the more difficult, I think, conversations, but I think everybody understands we have to take a significant and meaningful chunk of mandatory spending. One of them, Jason already mentioned, and that's work requirements for means-tested welfare programs. It's not good to trap people in independence and in poverty. And I think my fundamental belief, and I think this is going to be sort of expressed as a principle in our budget, it's not just about growing the economy and generating more revenue to pay down our debt. It's about human flourishing. It's about what freedom and prosperity and dignity of work and self-sufficiency does for our fellow Americans. And look, we're all susceptible to following the incentives, as Peter Drucker, the father of the science of management, says, behavior follows incentives. Our policies are incentives, and behavior follows. And we need behavior to be, hey, if you need the safety net, it's there for you but for the grace of God, go all of us. But you got to bounce back if you're an able-bodied adult. You got to get back in the workforce for your own sake, and I think in the issue of fairness for your fellow taxpayers. Rachel, and then I think I've got to get to Rachel. I'll stay. You can all leave, but I'm not going anywhere.
Anytime you could just take my call.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Just take the call.
So a lot of reporters, we've been trying to find out if you guys are going to do a budget that balances in 10 years.
Yeah.
We talked about work requirements for Medicaid. That
Yep.
gives you a whole chunk of money.
Does.
You don't touch Social Security and Medicare. How are you going to do that?
Makes it harder.
If you can't do it, have you guys started talking to conservative members of your conference about why the math might not add up there? And what sort of response are you getting on that?
Yeah, so I would just say, this is my view about long-term budget frameworks, whether it's the president's or it's a Republican framework. It is aspirational, and I suspect he would say the same about his 10-year budget. Next year's budget, 24, and anchoring at 22 spent, that's real. That's the most meaningful part of our budgeting exercise, in my opinion, and that's where we should focus the majority of our effort at this time. But having a North Star, and showing directionally where we would go as a party versus where the president is going, I think is important too. But here's a statistic that sort of backs up your question. When I was a freshman on the budget committee in 17, Diane Black, remember, was chair. We needed to save $6.5 trillion to balance in 10 years. Today you have to get 15 trillion in savings. So it's getting exponentially harder, but the commitment, Rachel, is there for the aspirational 10-year balance. We have to get to 18. And here's my message. We're going to have whatever that long-term metric and milestone is, because quite frankly, I think debt to GDP is the best metric of all. But whatever it is, we're going to see a stark difference in our direction and what we would do to restore fiscal sanity and to put our country on good financial footing and give our kids a chance to have the American dream relative to what the president has done. And then I think at that point, we're going to focus on what happens next year, because if people in West Texas, my people, don't see a real deficit spending reduction year over year, they're going to wonder what we're doing up here. And quite frankly, they've seen a lot of balanced budgets on paper coming out of Washington. And I don't know I don't know how much impact they had. I know the one in 17 that I was a part of in 18, where I came up to podiums like this and thumped my chest about balancing in 10 years. I know that we are further in the debt hole. Our deficit gap has widened, and our country is closer to the precipice of a debt crisis. So yes, long-term frameworks have their value, but I think what is most meaningful to the people in my district, and I think for the people in our conference after that discussion, I can say this for my committee, is what are we going to do over the next year or two? And quite frankly, I think that's the conversation that Speaker McCarthy is trying to have with our president and with our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, is how do we limit our spending like every hardworking American? How do we tighten our belts? How do we change our spending habits so that we can start turning the Titanic? And if Democrats aren't willing to have that conversation right now, and if the president isn't, when every American is having to do that on account of what's happening in this Biden economy, I think that there'll be a political price to pay, because I think that is a expectation of the American people right now. You all have to sit down like adults, and you all have to evaluate your spending like we do, and you all have to make a right sizing of your budgets like we are. And I know that's the Speaker's commitment, and we're here to provide options for the Speaker in our conference on that. Thank you, Rachel. Appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.